Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take a look at some of my older reviews and update them to my current quality standards. Today we're taking a look at Dark Messiah of Might and Magic for PC, although it was later re-released as Dark Messiah of Might and Magic Elements on Xbox 360. This is a first-person action game with role-playing elements, although I'd honestly consider it more of an action RPG when you get down to it, that was developed by Arcane Studios and published by Ubisoft in October 2006 for PC and later on in 2008 for Xbox 360. And it was released to a fairly lukewarm reception, although the Xbox 360 version got considerably lower marks than the PC version. Although I haven't played that version myself, so I can't really speak from experience on that. What I've heard is that the controls are pretty awful on console and that it looks like crap and runs like crap. But since I have no experience of that, I can't really confirm or deny it, so maybe somebody in the comments can comment on that if they've played the Xbox 360 version. Regardless, it was still released to a fairly mixed reception even on PC, where some people really enjoyed it and some people really hated it, with one of the big sticking points being that there are a ton of technical problems in this game, and it was like that on release, it's still like that even a decade later. While they did iron out some of the problems since the game's release, they still have several crashes in there, although oddly enough most of them are when you're trying to exit the game anyway. It'll just crash and you need to actually Alt-Tab and tell Windows to close the program. It's not that big of a deal, but it's mildly annoying. And I did run into a couple of crashes when I was recording and it was still in a loading screen, but that's a pretty limited circumstance that most of you won't be experiencing. And most of the problems that you run into with this thing, if there is some game-breaking bug, you can just reload a save and it's perfectly fine. Other than that, most of the bugs you're going to run into are nothing more than visual problems, so it's not really anything that breaks the experience, but it is mildly annoying. However, this game is a hell of a lot more than just a bunch of glitches, so let's go ahead and delve right into it and find out exactly how it is. Well, as far as the presentation goes, this does run on the Source engine, and it was one hell of a good looking game in its day, and even today it still looks pretty fantastic when you get down to it. Sure, there are a few things here and there that look a bit dated, namely the texture quality, but generally speaking, the modeling is very well done, the animations are generally fairly smooth, although there are a few here and there that are a bit janky. But what really steals the show in this are the environments, which look absolutely fantastic. There is a huge amount of detail packed into them, and things like the water effects still look brilliant to this day. Arcane really outdid themselves in that regard, and it really does pay off dividends in the long run, because even 10 years on, this game still looks brilliant. And there are even some times when you look at the environments and they look so good that you actually forget about some of the weird issues here and there with visual glitches and the lip syncing not being particularly great and things like that. Although there is one really nasty bugbear when it comes to the presentation itself, which is the actual cutscenes. The cutscenes themselves that are in-engine when you're actually playing the game look fine. They just put in some letterboxing and it's like, oh, well, this is a cutscene. But then there are the ones at the beginning and end of each particular level, and those are all pre-rendered and in a very, very low-quality video file, so they look really blurry and really, really awful. Of course, this is something that a lot of games suffered from over the years, and even to this day we still see it, but in this particular case, at least the cutscenes themselves are fairly short. But there is one thing that you're going to be having to put up with through the entire game, which is the sound design. Now, in some respects, it's actually pretty great. The soundtrack in particular has this nice fantasy epic feeling to it that really does fit what's going on, and yet when you're in a situation that's not as epic, it still manages to bring it down to a degree that's really acceptable. They did a good job with that. Likewise, they did a really good job with the sound effects. There is a lot of impact behind your swings. You really feel like when you swing your sword or your daggers or whatever it may well be, that you are swinging something that is nice and beefy. And you get some really nice impact sounds, so it feels like you're actually doing a lot of damage, even if you aren't necessarily doing all that much damage like you might be seeing in this video. I'll get more into that in a moment, but there is one really big bugbear I have with the sound design, and that is the voice acting, which ranges between just plain bad.
You go uphill past the golden rivet and sweet dragon's blood. What's that?
And so bad it's great. On the plain bad end of the spectrum, you have characters like Zana, who is just incredibly irritating the entire game because you're stuck with her pretty much the entire game. In the average to okay side of the spectrum, you have characters like Liana, who is just okay, she's just there, kinda.
Mr. Fenric, You must be Sareth. I was getting worried about you, though maybe for no reason. Uncle said you helped kill a Cyclops.
And then you have the so bad it's great end of the spectrum, like Zareth sometimes, who is your protagonist, who is really great at grunting and yelling and growling, but whenever he tries to open his mouth to say something a bit more than that, it either ends up with this kind of mild sarcasm that almost seems unintended, or with a complete disinterest, which is just amusing, or even better, hamming it up to no end. But then there's Master Fenrig, who pronounces everything with such a ridiculously goofy intonation that you can't help but chuckle at him.
Careful. The undead are tenacious. Impel them to make sure they don't rise again.
But overall, the voice acting is just so all over the place, it's going to be extremely hit or miss for you. Some you might find hilarious, some you might just find really annoying. It's just impossible to say how it's going to truly affect you in the long run, but it doesn't really detract too much from the experience. In fact, it kind of gives it a weird sense of charm instead. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you play as a guy named Zareth, who is studying under Master Fenrig at the very beginning of the game until he is sent to Stonehelm with a companion named Zana, who is basically implanted to some degree in his head, and she will speak to him throughout the game, give him advice, and generally make a lot of very lewd comments. And it's pretty obvious what she is right from the get-go, but I'm not going to really delve too far into that because that is spoiler territory, and the long and short of it is that Zareth ends up going on a quest to reclaim the Skull of Shadows, and along the way finds out that he's gotten himself in far deeper than he ever thought he would, and has to really adapt to the situation. Along the way, Zareth becomes more and more powerful, and you eventually do run across this idea of the prophecy of the Dark Messiah, which I won't really go into spoiler territory here with, but suffice to say, the plot itself ends up resolving in a fairly underwhelming fashion. There are actually different endings depending on your choices in the game, although those choices are really made more at the end game than anything else, and it's fairly obvious when you're making those decisions that they're actually going to impact the ending in some way. But while it is nice that your decisions can impact the outcome of the story itself really just isn't that great. It's not awful, but it's really not that great either, and it really isn't enough to hold your interest throughout. What really is going to hold your interest, however, is the gameplay. Now, this is a fairly linear game, although you do have some different paths you can take, and you do have some exploration, which is rewarded in fact, so you can actually find some items well before you're really supposed to, and they do actually have some pretty clever hiding spots for a lot of those items, so it really does encourage you to use everything at your disposal to explore the environment and see what you can find. And while some of these secret areas are pretty painfully obvious, like the one I'm going to show you as a prime example of a secret area here, others require you to actually solve a puzzle or complete a certain sequence of events in order to actually be able to access those secret areas, and those are the more interesting ones to find. In fact, there were some secret areas where even on this playthrough, which is about my 6th or 7th playthrough, I was still finding new secret areas, which is really, really cool. Of course, things really get interesting with regards to the secret areas and the traversal of the environment when you get access to the rope bow pretty early on in the game, and it allows you to shoot arrows into various wooden objects that will actually spawn ropes that you can actually jump on and climb and jump to other ropes with, and you can have a ton of these ropes all at once that allow you to basically chain maneuvers, and you can basically do some sort of platforming with them. And platforming is actually a thing in this game, although it's really not the game's strong suit, because the actual platforming takes a lot of getting used to, partly because your character has a bit more of a sense of momentum in this than most other first-person action games, so you do have to get used to the way that your character actually moves around in addition to the basic jumping and the rope bow mechanics and things like that. But that's all very easy to pick up on, and you get used to it within the first couple of levels very quickly, although they do still try to throw in some platforming segments that don't really work out as well as they could, like chasing down a ghoul in the very beginning of the game. It's just annoying. But once you get past that, the game really does open up quite a bit and lets you really experiment with its mechanics. You see, the real meat of this game is in its combat system, which is divided between 3 different things: melee combat, ranged combat, and magic. Now, melee can be further developed into a couple of different areas. You have your basic melee combat, which is just one-on-one or one against many or whatever it may well be, and then you have your stealth. Stealth is an entire set of skills that allows you to do things like lockpicking or backstabbing, so where you can sneak up behind an enemy with your daggers, and then you can get a quick, instant, silent kill with them. So that's actually pretty handy if you're trying to sneak up on a group of enemies and just use the stealth in general. The ranged combat is done through bows or through your actual magic. The bows are pretty straightforward, and at the beginning of the game they might seem really weak, although pretty much everything seems really weak at the very beginning of the game, because the bows in particular have a kind of slow draw time, and when you don't have the ability that lets you quickly shoot arrows, it really seems like they're terrible. Once you get that ability, they really become much more powerful, and you really do get a lot more out of them. In addition, they're extremely useful for setting things ablaze if you have a torch nearby or some other fire that you can stick your arrow into and actually light it on fire before you shoot it, or you can actually use things in the environment to actually take out enemies. So you can shoot a support on a set of barrels and it will collapse the supports, and then the barrels will fall onto an enemy, or things like that. So the environment plays a big role in this, and the bow is really handy for a lot of those environment kills. But if bows aren't really your thing, you can move over to the magic system, which allows you to use things like fireball spells, which have an area effect, or things like the basic fire arrow that you get really early on in the game if you choose to actually activate it in the skill set. And it will just set things on fire, or it'll do minimal damage. You get a telekinesis spell, you get various trap spells you can lay down, you can freeze enemies and then shatter them, all sorts of really cool magic abilities that you get, which of course drain your mana, and of course you get a bunch of mana potions to restore that very quickly and easily throughout the game. So as long as you're not completely wasting your mana, you can use those magic abilities pretty regularly and not be completely useless. But what really steals the show in this is the melee combat itself, which is pretty much the best melee combat system we've seen in a first-person game. A lot of people would like to point to something like Chivalry Medieval Warfare, and yes, it does have a rather good melee system for a multiplayer game. For single player, there hasn't really been anything better than this. And frankly, this system is a bit better than Chivalry's anyway. You have your basic attack where you can just tap the button and you'll swing your weapon around with a very light amount of force. It won't do much damage, and they can very easily block it if they're a humanoid enemy like a goblin, an orc, or an actual human or something like that. But it's useful if you want to wear down your enemy. And then there are the power attacks that you can do, where you hold the button down, and depending on the direction you're moving, or if you're not moving at all, you can do a different kind of power attack. So you can do forward and backward power attacks with swords, which will do thrusts, or you can do left and right, which will be different kinds of slashes, or you can do a basic standing attack, which is going to be a downward chop. And each of these has their own specific arc that you need to be aware of when you're actually swinging the sword, otherwise you're not going to hit what you're trying to hit. And you do have to keep in mind that things will actually try to dodge out of the way, or things will try to block, and you can actually compensate for that and actually end up hitting your target instead. Now, of course, each specific category of weapons, which are swords, daggers, staves, and the miscellaneous stuff that you're going to find, like axes or pickaxes or whatever, are going to have different attack patterns. So the swords are pretty straightforward. The daggers are also pretty straightforward. You get a lot of bleed over because you're using two weapons at once, and what ends up happening is you end up striking twice with your daggers, and so you end up doing basically full damage that way instead of actually only doing a bit of damage at a time like you do with the normal flurries with those. And then there are the staves, which are rather hard to use because they just kind of twirl around to a ridiculous degree. So they're actually kind of hard to get used to, but if you do get used to them, they have the absolute most knockback of any of the melee weapons that you get. The swords are very well rounded. The daggers do damage very quickly, but they don't do a lot of damage. And then the staves don't really do a huge amount of damage, but they have a lot of knockback to them. So that is something to keep in mind. You may want to vary up your weapons as you need them. So if something is coming at you that needs a lot of knockback, you might want to switch over to a staff really quick, and then use that to knock it down, maybe switch over to a sword to finish it off, or something like that. You're only as limited as your abilities, so with certain weapons, they are going to have certain skill requirements. For example, the Superior Naga Silk Sword you see me using a lot in this video has a skill requirement of critical hit level 2. And so if you don't have critical hit level 2, then you can't use it. To get to critical hit level 2, you need to get a bunch of other abilities first, and these are unlocked via skill points that you earn for doing various things throughout the game, mostly completing objectives, and on occasion you will actually find extra skill points by actually completing side objectives. Now while they do give you quite a lot of points throughout the game, they don't give you enough to get every single skill in the game, so what you're going to need to do is actually specialize. Do you want to be melee? Do you want to be stealth? Do you want to be ranged? Or do you want to be magic? You can have some combination of them, but it is fairly limited, so you do need to keep that in mind. Normally I end up going for a melee and stealth build, so I end up having all my points into the melee abilities and in some of the stealth abilities. Basically, I get the lockpicking and the stealth up to the point where you can backstab with it, and that's generally well enough for me, but if you wanted to be a mage, you could actually get all of the spells, and then you could get something else to go along with it, maybe some extra melee abilities so you're not completely useless with your staves or whatever, and that makes you well-rounded enough that you're not completely useless in anything other than simply spellcasting. So the game does encourage you to experiment and find your own real play style. Mine mostly revolves around melee combat because I just find that the most satisfying part of the game. I mean, let's face it, chopping enemies' heads and arms and legs and such off is just incredibly satisfying to do, and especially when you go into the fatality mode, where you've built up your adrenaline meter, and then you can actually execute a fatality move, which instantly kills the opponent you're attacking, and depending on the attack you hit them with when you're actually doing that, is either going to dismember them or impale them, and then you're going to kick them off of your blade. Although you do need to be careful, because I found out during this playthrough actually that you can actually trigger that on your companions, and if you do that on your companions, you will instantly lose the level. So the game does encourage you not to simply run in swinging your sword wildly like an idiot. Instead, it encourages you to be very careful with your application of force, and often encourages you to use the environment to help take out a larger group of enemies. And this is something that some people have issue with in this particular game because it makes the game too easy, so to speak. The idea that you can kick enemies into spike racks, or kick them off cliffs, or into flames and set them on fire, or you can hit something in the environment like, say, a rope holding up a swinging pendulum that will instantly annihilate some foes, just seems to make the game too easy for a lot of people. Well, maybe if you're playing on normal difficulty, yes. What you see me playing in this is hard mode, but what you haven't seen is the numerous 1 or 2 hit deaths that I experience regularly throughout hard mode, and there's a difficulty setting higher than that. So for those of you who are thinking, oh, well, the kick makes things too easy, because you can kick enemies into spike racks and off cliffs and such, and that instantly kills them. Well, yes, but on hard mode and higher than that, you're looking for every advantage you can possibly get. On normal mode, they're optional. They're just something you can do if you want to. So, for example, if you see an orc at a perfect spot to kick him off a cliff, and you do so, and you kind of laugh maniacally as he screams while falling off the cliff, well, that's just an option during play. In hard mode, it's almost expected of you to do something like that, because fighting a large group of enemies in hard mode is very, very difficult at times. Particularly when they start throwing large groups of enemies at you, or a mixed group of enemies, so you'll have some that are melee and some that are ranged. So you need to be very careful of what is actually attacking you at any given time. And it's not like the kick is just something infinite. You actually do have a stamina meter that will drain depending on whether you're sprinting or whether you're kicking. And you do need to be pretty careful with that, because if you just keep kicking over and over and over again, you're going to run out of stamina and not be able to kick anymore when you could really, really use it. So I discovered on the harder mode that the game really encourages you to use everything at your disposal. Not just your sword, not just your daggers, not just your bow, not just your magic, not just kicking things. Use everything you possibly can to annihilate your foes, and use it smartly. And that's something I feel that a lot of reviewers at the time didn't really get, because you end up with some really amusing quotes like, "The adventures of Sir Kixalot Deathboot in the land of the conspicuously placed spike racks." I mean, sure, that's a rather amusing quote, and to some degree it is correct. There are a lot of very conspicuously placed spike racks in this game. But it's not entirely about kicking things. You use the kick to create an opening, or you use it in a perfect situation to kick an enemy into a spike rack, or a flame, or off a cliff, or something like that, to where it will either outright annihilate them, or it will severely damage them enough that they're not really a problem anymore. That's not to say that the game doesn't have problems. It certainly does. I mean, the boss fights aren't really all that great. You mostly just aim at the weak spot on a Cyclops until it finally gets on its knees, and then you finish it off by stabbing it in the eye. That's not even a spoiler, by the way. They show you how to do that at the beginning of the game. And that's just one example of the boss fights, but other than that, the non-humanoid enemies tend to be the ones that really either just grind your gears, or they are really just pushovers. This game has a bizarre obsession with spiders, whether it be just small ones that crawl on the walls or big ones that crawl on the walls and poison you when they hit you. And so that's really great if you're arachnophobic like me, but hey, you can set them on fire and that's always fun. But when you aren't setting them on fire, they're really not that fun to fight, because they are a bit hard to hit sometimes with the way the animations work out, and they jump around a lot, and they just end up being damage sponges more than anything else. They're really easy to dodge, actually. So they really become more annoying and just kind of creeping you out than anything else. And likewise goes for the zombies. They can actually spit poison at you and thus poison you, so you need antidotes on hand. But they are really just kind of pushovers when you're actually fighting them themselves, unless you're on hard mode like I was. See, everything becomes dangerous on hard mode, even things like goblins. But the game really does come into its own when you're fighting things like goblins or orcs or humanoids, because they can fight back much more easily, they can actually parry your attacks, and they tend to come at you in groups, with some of them actually having ranged capabilities and others of them being in melee, so you actually do need to vary up your tactics a lot more than when you're simply fighting spiders or simply fighting zombies or something like that. But even with some of the enemies just not being all that great to fight, the way the game is paced means that you're not going to ever be fighting one of those particular types of enemies way too long, and they do try to throw in a bunch of other enemy types at you at once. They try to vary things up in the environments to give you different traps to work with, or different exploration. They give you boss fights to really spice up the gameplay, and generally speaking, it ends up not really being that much of an issue. Sometimes it can drag on a bit. For example, when you go through a spider nest in the one particular part of the game, which admittedly mostly drags on because I'm arachnophobic. But regardless, it still was paced in a way where when it felt like it was dragging, eventually when I got out of that area, it started picking up right back again, and I was like, oh wait, that area that I was just in, that really wasn't that long. It just felt like it was long because I'm arachnophobic, or it felt like it was long because I got stuck at one particular part trying to get through a certain secret area that I knew I remembered how to get to, but I was just messing up for some reason. Very rarely do you encounter an area that is played out for too long, and even if it is played out for too long, it's mostly because you end up looking around for secrets which may or may not be there. So for the most part, the single player ends up being an absolute joy to play. It's just incredibly fun to eviscerate your foes with the various methods available to you in this, and even though the combat does get kind of repetitive, you end up not really caring just because the combat itself is so satisfying. But then there's the one thing about it that pretty much everybody agrees really isn't that good, and that's the multiplayer. Now, unfortunately, you can't play that anymore at all, because apparently they shut down the master server specifically for Dark Messiah, and so you actually can't get into any servers. Even then, back when I originally played this for review, there were barely any people playing it. In fact, there weren't enough to get into a full game, so that was kind of problematic. The idea was that you picked a class to play, and you could only level up your abilities within that specific class, but it gave you a set of equipment, it gave you a set of abilities that were basically taken from the single player, and you basically just competed in a battle across a large map. It really wasn't all that interesting, and it wasn't really fun to play back in the day, and more importantly, it was kind of laggy and buggy, so basically nobody ended up playing it, and the multiplayer died a fairly quick death. But the single player is still very much worth playing. This is an excellent game once you get down to it. Sure, it has problems. I mean, sure, what game doesn't have problems? But this one manages to get past all of the ridiculous amounts of technical problems that it has and the seemingly repetitive gameplay, and just becomes an incredibly fun game to play. And ultimately, it succeeds so well on that point that even with its problems, and even with certain areas of the game just being kind of a slog for me to play because of arachnophobia and such like that, it still managed to become one of my personal favorites. Ultimately, the score I originally gave it still stands. It's still a 4 out of 5 kind of game. It's still a fantastic game to play, but it has very significant problems that you will need to overcome. You will need to overcome some pretty significant technical problems. You will need to get used to the way the game plays. And it's not for everyone. But if you're the kind of person who would get anything out of this game, get it. It is well worth it. Thanks for watching.